Singularity Watch, a show where we read between the lines of the emerging worlds. I'm Ollie, and as always, my co-host and inventor of the show is award-winning cybersecurity professional Kavya Perlman, founder of XRSI, the XR Safety Initiative. Today, we're talking to Kurt Opsahl. Is that right? How to pronounce it?
Yeah, Opsahl.
Okay. Deputy Executive Director and General Counsel of the Electronic Frontier Foundation, better known as EFF. Kurt, hello, and thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me here. Hello, everybody.
In the past, the Department of Justice at one point defined you as a rabid dog. How did you feel about that, and what does it mean?
Well, that came from basically my response to government demands for subpoenas. Apparently, one of the DOJ attorneys told someone that, well, you didn't have to sick your rabid dog on me. And I was delighted. I thought that was very colorful way of putting it. I put it into my bio, and naturally it becomes one of the first questions at interviews.
Yeah.
But it was delightful. It was because I was fighting hard for my client and trying to protect people's privacy.
Awesome. So it's almost basically a compliment in an indirect way.
That's super nice. In fact, and Kurt, first of all, thank you for being here and representing EFF. It has been great watching EFF, put out these blogs that you have contributed to and take positions on things like rights repair for XR and, things that you are kind of studying in XR. It's really remarkable to see because, past 1.5 year XRSI has been sort of contributing to it. So I'm really glad that more human rights organizations such as EFF are now paying attention to AR, VR, and we really need your help in this. And with that, I really just want to ask you, you've represented so many companies and persons on civil liberties and free speech and privacy law challenges. How does this plug into this new, emerging technology domain? And what do you think? What is your assessment so far as you are looking at this domain? What's happening with respect to these really critical aspects that we have to encounter?
Absolutely. I mean, this is something that has been happening, over the last 20, 30 years as law intersects with technology. And so I've been looking at the evolution as law intersects with technology since, before there was a World Wide Web. There were questions dealing with bulletin board systems. Then, there came a time when there were a lot of questions about software applications, operating systems, websites. Each time a technology gets introduced, it raises some interesting questions. And VR is raising a lot of very interesting questions.
Right.
It hits a number of issues that we've seen before, but it also presents some very new challenges. VR has possibilities to create virtual worlds that are a whole host of IP, intellectual property issues that come around with the worlds people are creating and how those interact with people. There are privacy issues. The VR is taking a little bit of information from you, but in time will take even more, scanning your eyes are looking. AR, I think, adds even more of an element to that because you're combining some of these things with the real world, and so it is a bit of a crossover in the amount of data. So here in my house, the headset I'm using has data about what the room. I set it up in, what the dimensions are, and warn me if I'm going to crash into something.
Right.
But if I'm with an AR, this can be not only affecting things in my house where either it's my stuff or I've gotten permission from other people, but other people in the universe. So lots of fascinating issues, and I'm glad to be looking at it strongly.
That's awesome.
Cool.
And we are really glad that you are looking into it. We need more people such as yourself to teach us, to guide us.
Absolutely. So taking a leap back into the past, in 2003, you co-authored the Electronic Media and Privacy Law Handbook. So 70 years is a pretty long time in the media industry. Do you think there's much which is still valid in what you wrote in 2003? For instance, the principles, or I don't know.
There is. Actually, since the book got published, I took some of the content of it and made a website that was trying to update the website as the law evolved. That eventually became too much of a project, so the website, it still exists, ilt.eff.org for Internet Law Treatise, but it itself hasn't been updated in a number of years. But so what the handbook was a description of the law in various areas that had to do with electronic media and privacy. Things like the Electronic Communications Privacy Act, the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, which is the sort of federal anti-hacking statutes, went through intellectual property laws, went through a variety of privacy laws, defamation online, all these issues that were hot in 2003. And like the cases that it cites, the laws that it cites, many of them are still, valid law. A lot of them, though, have had further cases interpreting it, further, situations that have been applied to. So it's not, it could be a starting point for someone's learning about it, but it certainly can't be the ending point because so much has changed.
Totally.
Okay. And so there are things that are basically outdated in it, but there are parts that are still good to start off with.
Yeah. And so, Kurt, let's talk about, you wrote in your blog something about Panopticon. And what is it? And how can we avoid this type of scenario playing out in XR space?
Yes, sir. So Panopticon, it's actually a reference to a prison design from over 100 years ago, where there would be all of the prisoners' cells in a circle surrounding a guard tower, such that each of the cells was totally visible to the guard. And the notion was that you would have limited staffing put into the guard tower, but each of the prisoners would never know. They could be observed at any time. And the idea was to incentivize their compliant behavior because they were under constant observation. There was nowhere to hide.
Wow.
And since then, not very many prisons ended up being designed exactly in this way. This was done before there were things like security cameras, other ways of doing it. But it's become a metaphor for a life in which you are constantly observed. And we're becoming more and more to that point as a society in general. So, if you go to the city of London, for example, there are cameras virtually everywhere. It would be very hard to find a spot there that doesn't have at least one camera.
Right.
In Washington, D.C., also festooned with cameras. The Panopticon, it has tremendous things for civil liberties, for people who want to have the right to be left alone,
right.
To be able to go about their business without everybody being able to see it, without the government looking over their shoulder. And how does this interact with AR, XR? Is if you are using these devices in, I think, two ways. One is the AR devices or XR devices that you're wearable, and they are creating zones of information all around you as people walk through the world. And it's not just, personal devices. Also, everyone doing self-driving cars is taking radar images, LiDAR images of everything that's around them and mapping the space. And then there's also in your home. If you are setting up your home, there's a LiDAR image of your house. And in some cases, you can create basically a mirror world so that all the privacy implications of someone being able to wander around your house are present as well in the virtual space.
Wow. And that is
wow.
It also reminds me of Project Aria. And, within Project Aria, some of the trust and safety feature, like when you're talking about this Panopticon, is like practically be able to observe people constantly in world. And apparently that whatever invisible cop is, you can summon that invisible cop to observe you, and that would be a real person. It was just kind of a twisted sort of a security control to control behavior in world, and it totally matches what you just described.
Yeah, I mean, so this is like one of the great challenges is there are trust and safety issues that occur, especially in environments where people are coming to interact with strangers, where they don't have some of the social relationships that make it so someone maybe not want to call you out or harass you in a space. They feel maybe freer to do that. And you want to be able to like sort of protect people.
Mm-hmm.
At the same time, there's just a tremendous amount. So the virtual police coming to your house, coming to your space. Mm-hmm. I think at least in some of the trust and safety things, they're just going to sort of see what was going on there, but we don't know exactly how much data they're having. The actual police, they come to your house. One is if you say no, they have to get a warrant to come in. That's our traditional rule if they're investigated. Right. And if they're in your house, they can look around and see what's in plain sight, but they're limited by their senses. If a virtual police shows up in your virtual house, they could have all sorts of accessible data, that everything is in plain sight to them, unless there are controls about what information is provided. And that's kind of the thing, is to navigate these spaces. We want to create a future we would want to live in. We want to create a opportunity to use these cool technologies, be able to take advantage of their promise without fundamentally changing our notions of privacy, autonomy, and sort of giving up some of the things that are important to civilization in our society.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, also because I think a lot of people seem to think that, the virtual world is, as it is now, maybe just an extra. But I guess as we go forward, if you're not in that, you're going to be left out in many ways, like you already are if you don't have social networks or stuff like that, because everybody works in that dimension now. So it's going to be really important how this is regulated and seen, I guess, right?
Absolutely. I mean, I think we've seen over the last, since March, basically, when the pandemic hit, a lot of people are turning to virtual spaces because they are trapped in their physical space. And more people are adopting these technologies, and it's just sort of at the beginning of adoption, but it's going to be an important place of how people are existing and interacting with other people more and more so every year.
Yeah. This kind of leads back to a recent article you wrote, published in the EFF, where you talk about the so-called world's digital twin, or metaverse. The idea of creating machine-readable one-to-one scale models of the world are continuously updated in real time, and persistent 3D digital clone of the world aligned with real-world coordinates, which sounds a bit like something that I heard, something to do with Facebook. I can't remember the name, what it was called. But anyway, you mentioned that this new digital world will introduce a new world of privacy concerns. Can you tell us a bit more about this and delve into that a bit?
Yeah, absolutely. So we've looked at some examples of technology where it has created a mirror version of say, your house, right? And I linked to some videos people can watch on the blog post, and you can see a side by side where there's one which is just a regular video of the house, and one is a virtual version, and the similarity is uncanny. And you can see purposes of this. If you want to have someone visit your house, they live 1,000 miles away. If you have one of these virtual copies, they can come to your house, they can walk around, you can actually have a housewarming party with your friends who are distant. Either they can't move because of the pandemic, or it's just too far to travel. Cool things like that. Many more technologies could come out of there, many more social utilities. But it is this, and it's the effect. The same thing is if the governmental authorities are looking at the virtual version of their house, and you leave your subversive literature on the coffee table, then that information is available to anyone who might look. And you might say, like in some regimes, I mean, no big deal. You're not going to be that mad that you have a copy of certain literature. But that's not the case all around the world. There are plenty of places where the governments care a lot about what their citizens are doing and reading in their personal spaces, and if they have access to that material, it'd be quite significant.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
Material as well as, maybe somebody has a prescription drug or some of the inferences, wouldn't you say, like, things that may not be apparent to you, but in VR you can infer that somebody is about to have a heart attack, or, all kinds of inferences can be made, don't you think?
So yeah, inferences is a very interesting thing. I think it brings up a couple of issues. I mean, one is, are they making good or bad inferences? Because I think a lot of people don't like to be judged. Don't like to be judged incorrectly. Sometimes people don't like to be judged correctly.
Right.
But having the sort of the notion that the machine is determining something about you and making a decision based on that. So one important part of this, very critical, is more transparency about what the inferences are and how those inferences are going to be used. Mm-hmm. Some people might be okay with an inference that, while they watched one movie on Netflix and they want to see what Netflix recommends more of the same. Okay, that's a great inference from my behavior. Or you might be like, well, I would like to actually set it so that if it makes an inference that I've got a health issue, that I should talk to my doctor and it can notify something ahead of time. But other times it really feels creepy. There's a famous incident when I think it was Target started sending ads about baby stuff and pregnancy stuff to someone who had not yet known and been tested to confirm they were pregnant.
Oh, wow.
And they were like, why is all this? And then they found out later that they were pregnant. And, that was creepy.
Wow.
That is creepy.
Yeah.
That's more than creepy. It's almost morbid. Yeah. As with regards to virtual reality, there's another article where you wrote about the ability of AR, VR headsets to request audio and video of the inside of your house. So telemetry about movements, depth data, images, and be able to basically reconstruct your house. So there was mentioned that system, like a localization or mapping system, SLAM, I think it was called. And then you say if the government wants to get that information, it needs to bring a warrant. So are we in a gray area, or are we getting into a place where data ends up in a black hole, so to speak?
Well, I would say that, as explained in that article, under sort of the evolving Supreme Court law, there had been for a while a notion that if data is held by a third party, you have less privacy protections with it. And this was called the third party doctrine. But a number of cases that have been dealing with situations using older technologies, using basically technologies coming out with the phones, with location tracking, but hitting on the issue that just because data that was previously very private and very hard for the government to obtain is now more readily available, doesn't mean that we have to give up all of our rights. And I think that's the important principle. So yeah, the government should come back with a warrant. Make sure that we apply the same principles that we've had since the founding of this country, and actually principles also in keeping with international human rights law, and make sure that they also adequately protect the privacy and autonomy of your personal space. Now, does this make this a data black hole? I haven't heard the black hole as a metaphor. I think oftentimes the government, the U.S. government, talks about going dark, which is a term they use saying, well, it's harder for us to get certain kinds of information now. Mostly it's about complaining encryption. But I think actually it is a surveiller's paradise at the moment. The amount of data that you can get about people already is eye-openingly crazy.
Yeah.
And if we start applying some of the principles like requiring a warrant for getting to a virtual copy of your private place, this would be rebalancing things more to the situation in which we've always enjoyed.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you think are you more worried about governments getting their hands on a lot of data about personal space and people's houses, or more big companies, or both, I guess?
I mean, I think there are concerns around both. At this point, however, that the companies don't have the power to arrest you and put you in jail. Like, there are reasons to be sort of more concerned about government access to intensely personal data, and especially if people are in authoritarian or non-democratic regimes. But I think that there's also people who have a tremendous interest in having control over their own information, so they share that information with who they want to share it with, but don't share with others, and have that kind of control. We've seen that in things like the GDPR, the European Privacy Directive.
Mm-hmm.
We've seen the CCPA in California, and now that is being revised under Prop 24. But there has been some pushback to give people more control about knowing what information the company has, having some rights to withdraw consent once given, be able to take their information out if they don't want the company to have it anymore. And I think this is something that is important also for giving people a sense of privacy and autonomy in their very personal information. And I think people also need to know what the company, they need to make an informed choice. And the only way to make an informed choice is to know what the company will be doing with that information, how securely it will be kept, whether what circumstances that information will be shared again.
Totally.
Right.
And you talk about, Kurt, about the CCPA, California Consumer Privacy Act. Your
mic is a little low right now.
Yeah. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Better. Okay. So yeah, you talked about CCPA, and last November it seems and including myself, we voted to make that into a law and promote it and adopt it. So regardless of all these laws coming in, it seems like there is still quite a bit of gap. There is a lot of catching up. So what could be a potential, not a stopgap, but what could be the potential approach that we could take to avoid, both of these threats? So one, you're saying surveillance capitalism. Then the other part is, these companies just really using this data, collecting it for one purpose, using it for another purpose. So what is this thing that we could do as an industry, as XR industry, to try to protect ourselves in the meantime until, I don't think it would ever happen, but it's a good dream to have that regulations will catch up to technology.
Yeah, I think regulations, the inherent problem with a regulation is that even the perfect regulation is perfect for the understanding of technology as it exists today that is passed. And it takes longer to update or change a regulation than technology advances. So people try to solve this by writing things in ways that are more future-proof, hitting some general principles, but still then there comes the question of how that applies in other circumstances. So general principles of requiring consent, having people can withdraw consent, that can be applied to a lot of circumstances, but it's still going to be a challenge to have the right regulation that fits. And sometimes there can be unintended consequences or unintended situations. I mean, for example, a thing that is commonplace in some of these privacy regulations is the ability to find out all the data that a company holds. And that makes sense. People want to know what information is being held.
Right.
But another aspect of that is if a bad actor then goes to the company and says, "You're their you," and they get that data, they now have all of your information. So as a potential security hole. So you have to make sure that even if you're trying to apply that principle, you're not inadvertently creating another privacy problem where people's information is given to third party.
Mm-hmm.
So I think there's a lot to be done in terms of being transparent about things, having privacy policies that are not just written to try and protect the company from liability, but to explain as best possible what will be done with people's information. And I think when you look at some of the privacy scandals we've had over the last decade, a lot of the scandals have rooted in something where you might arguably have a privacy policy that said they could do this, but no one either read it, or if they did read it, they didn't understand what the implications were.
Right.
And so I would say to all the companies out there working in this space, if you want to avoid a privacy scandal, then you have to make sure that everyone actually understands what you're doing. So you explain it to them in a way that afterwards they're like, yes, that is what I wanted. And if someone points out, well, this data is collected and it's given this way, you're like, yes, and that is exactly what I agreed to, so that's fine.
Right.
And I also, as a warning for the companies, entering in the space, developing new products, there have been a couple of times where a new product had a privacy fail early on, and then it failed as a product. Like, as a successful thing, people were like, oh, that was too creepy, I don't like this thing about it, and no one used it, and people have lost out on their whole investment in the product because they didn't think about these issues on launch, on creation.
Yeah. Seems like what you're saying is pretty consistent with what we heard one other guest. She's a neuro researcher and is paying attention to XR, Sophia Batchelor. And it was quite insightful when she mentioned, self-governance could be one of those things. And, we're kind of working on the privacy framework for that. And I feel like that's probably, would you say, that company could pay attention to, where they take control, they take in consideration context of what is being shared, but make their own sort of rules until we have those external laws and regulations.
I mean, certainly, I think there is something very useful for companies taking a lead in self-governance. But I think a lot of people are suspicious that companies don't have their interests at heart. For some of the companies operating in the tech space, there has been a history of privacy problems. And it's important, if you're going to do any kind of self-governance work, to do it in a way that earns people's trust. Trust and verification, so that if you say, okay, we're going to do these things to protect you, do these things that will help with the privacy issues, that they trust that actually will happen, that you're not going to be using some word choice there that gives you an out. And a lot of this trust violations have come from people saying, we're going to collect this information for this purpose. You're like, great, that's a purpose I like. I want you to do that. And then they're like, hey, I'm going to use this information for a new purpose now. And I'm not going to ask because, that's the way I roll. And people really, really don't like that. Facebook got in a lot of trouble doing that. They have an FTC decree requiring them to get more consent out of people. But as a general practice, remember that people have trusted you with information, and if you want to use it for something else, you have to trust them to be able to make a decision about whether to use it for the new thing.
Absolutely. Kurt, as we're heading towards the end of the episode, so I'm going to do a more lighthearted question for you now. What type of items or objects would you put in front of the trackers to mess with them and muddy the waters around the identity of the person playing? Could be an idea for people watching.
So putting in things in front of the trackers to mess with. I mean, I don't know. I haven't thought about that. I mean, I think in the real world, with cameras, people sometimes will do things. They'll have, like, if your neighbor has a camera, then you'll plant a large bush in your backyard to place.
Yeah, absolutely.
Otherwise, one of the things actually we're seeing right now is that there's a lot of facial recognition tracking people in a real world space. And people are now wearing masks on the place to deal with the pandemic. Has the extra bonus, when you're wearing a mask, it's a lot harder to do facial recognition. And as is recommended, you're supposed to wear a full face mask, and that's also the best way to protect against facial recognition.
Yeah, there's been a lot more thefts and stuff on the street going on recently, I think, because of this as well, because obviously people can get away with it because they got a mask on.
Well, it used to be if I went into the bank with my mask on, people were all like freaking out. But now,
it's just normal.
That's the norm.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so time for the final question. Kurt, what does the word singularity mean to you? And when will we see one, or have we seen one ever already, or your point of view on this word, as it's the name of the show?
So it's an interesting question. I think there's a lot of actually different definitions of what singularity might mean. I think one that I've seen a lot is looking at sort of the development of artificial intelligence and machine learning. We come to a point where the artificial intelligence is better at making new software and artificial intelligence than we are, and then the one that it makes is yet even better, and then goes on to sort of a singularity moving forward. Another looking is when we're sort of embedding technology into our lives to the point where we're wearing enough wearables and using, I think in this place a lot of XR technologies come into play, where we're having sort of basing a different self. Our self is not just who we are wearing something, but all these wearables or things are part of who we are. And I don't have a strong feeling about what is the right definition. It's more that the singularity is discussing that a point at which technology becomes embedded in our lives, it becomes sort of more potent than we are currently ready to fully understand. And then we get to that point. I think it's good we're doing a lot of thinking about it, trying to figure out how to do it best, how to do it where we're preserving the values and fundamental human rights that we've had for years.
Okay, well, that's a very balanced and kind of good answer. So when do you think we're going to see one?
Oh, I don't know. Possibly, probably in our lifetimes, but not immediately.
Okay, well, I'll look forward to that. Okay, so Kurt, thank you for being here today. It's been really interesting talking to you, and I hope maybe you'll be back someday.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's great.
Yeah, thank you, Kurt. Really excited for EFF taking positions, taking lead on so many of these things, and really glad that you are there with all these experience from various different, previous technologies. So thank you from, every one of us. I'm sure XRSI teams appreciates it because there's so many pointers that you're putting out there that actually go into, building our assessments and stuff. So thank you.
Well, my pleasure. Great to be here.
Also, big thanks to my co-host, Kavi Perlman, to Marco Magnano, the editor of the show, and the rest of the team, Ryan Wegner, Tim Stifler-Deem, David Chavert, and Ross Newman. To all of you viewing or listening, you can follow us on readyhackerone.com. Find us on Facebook or YouTube under the name Singularity Watch, where you can watch our shows. Or if you want the audio only, you can listen to our podcast on Spotify, Spreaker, and Apple Podcasts. And that's all for now. Happy journeys to all of you.